Let's talk about Fort Solis and how it's probably one of my most disappointing games of the year. This is a new narrative adventure game. It stars Roger Clark and Troy Baker. It is a game that I honestly had high hopes for. I think visually it's solid because it does run in Unreal Engine 5. I played this on PlayStation 5 on performance mode. I did not want to try to run it on quality. I didn't want to have that many frame hiccups because even on performance mode, it wasn't running too hot in certain places. I understand that on Steam, some of the reviews were pretty negative. It's been getting brutalized right now, and that's primarily because the game feels unoptimized. But I will say that outside of some solid performances and some really cool visuals, Fort Solis is overall a pretty big disappointment. This is a narrative adventure game. You are going to be going fairly slow, and I think that's completely fine for the first couple of chapters. In fact, I actually enjoyed it because as I was going through these areas, you could kind of feel the tension build up because Roger Clark's character, Jack, who you primarily control throughout the game, is conversing with his partner, Jessica, and there's like this really fun back and forth between them. They start making all these different movie references. They start talking about these different horror tropes, and it ends up being like really fun seeing how Jack kind of gets panicked and he's very slow to kind of investigate, and that's completely fine. But there's a point in which you get to the second half of the game where it turns into a thriller. And if you've ever seen something like Sunshine with Cillian Murphy, there's a point in that movie where it becomes kind of this slasher, and you expect the characters to kind of increase their pace. And that's the expectation here in Fort Solis. But unfortunately, that never happens. You are moving consistently at that pace unless there is some type of QTE. But the thing is, the QTEs in this game are actually kind of rare. And no matter what, even if, let's say your character gets attacked, which happens a few times in the game, you're then just walking normally as if nothing happened. So there's no sense of urgency, which is really shocking to me because I thought that in these types of games, that as soon as we got out of this investigative phase, as soon as we got out of that mystery phase and we knew that it was turning to a thriller, then you would think that the tempo would increase. But that is not the case, and it absolutely kills Fort Solis. It also doesn't help that Fort Solis doesn't have a gripping narrative. I really feel like once you get past chapter 2, it's pretty predictable. There is probably one moment where you're probably telling yourself, I didn't see that coming. But beyond that, it just feels like other games have done it better. Other movies and TV shows have done it better. And Fort Solis would have probably benefited from just sticking as a sci-fi mystery game instead of trying to devolve into this thriller, which literally conflicted with its walking mechanic. It didn't make any sense to me for you to continuously just start walking even as a really tense scene happened. I just couldn't imagine the developers sitting there and saying, this was a good idea. Because I really feel that Fort Solis would have worked better as a sci-fi mystery. Your movement is so slow, and there's such an emphasis on investigation and really taking your time early on that this dramatic shift, especially when it comes to its tone, doesn't make sense because your player does not match that speed. So if you just kept as a mystery, I think a lot of people would have forgiven the fact that you move so slow. But instead, you tried to just up the pace, but only in the plot. You didn't up the pace with the character or none of that, and I can't stress that enough because it just ended up making Fort Solis this big disappointment. Outside of those major critiques, there's probably a number of things that you could nitpick at. For example, I wasn't a big fan of the QTs in this game. I felt like they were hit or miss, especially with the way they were trying to have you use two buttons at the same time. Sometimes it just wouldn't work when you were just trying to hold R1 and then rotate in a certain direction. For whatever reason, it just did not feel natural to me. I also felt like there were some QTEs, especially in combat, that would just pop up wherever and it would be so quick, like you'd have to not blink to see it. Otherwise, you were going to miss it. There was also QTEs with certain scenes where it was for direct movement, so moving left or right or up or down, whatever. And the QTE would just pop up on screen, but it would take so long because they were trying to set up the scene. So your character would just freeze in place, which is weird because for the most part, the character is in motion the entire time. So I thought at the end of the game that it crashed on me, but instead it was just setting up for a scene. Another nitpick I had was character reactions to major discoveries, because you'd have like this moment where you're finding a dead body or you're seeing like a panel that was sabotaged or something, and then you're expecting your character to have this really serious moment, and let's say they do, but then when they go into the next room to investigate, they break into like this humorous banter as if like nothing happened, and I'm like, you guys just saw a dead body, more than likely for the first time ever, and for some reason you seem pretty calm and casual about it, which really concerned me at times, especially when you saw Jack find a body and he's like, oh, there's a couple stab wounds here, there's contact personnel, and it would seem like we're kind of getting into that moment of like, hey, there's going to be a lot of tension here, we're going to cut out some of the funny dialogue, and then they'd go and you just back to normal investigating, and I'm like, your reactions to this are far too casual, especially considering the seriousness of the situation you find yourself in. And I always found that was weird because it happens far too often in this game. And also, some of the decisions that your characters make are just so dumb. And I hate the fact that the game forces you to make those dumb decisions, knowing that you have probably seen a number of horror films, a number of thrillers, knowing that if you walk down that corridor, that dark part of that hallway, that you're more than likely going to be attacked. And I always feel like in these types of games, you shouldn't ruin that tension by trying to kind of force it. I've always felt like if you're going to have manufactured tension, you have to sustain it at times. But instead of sustaining that tension, it just like disappears for whatever reason, and your characters go back to acting normally, which I thought was just such a weird thing to do in this game. And it's such a big nitpick of mine. There's probably some things I'm missing, but overall, Fort Solis is a flat experience, and I feel like you should spend your time elsewhere. I think that in terms of a narrative title, there are far better games out there. There are far better movies that I could recommend or TV shows. I just don't feel like Fort Solis does anything interesting, and at times it really feels like it's just a showcase for the Unreal Engine 5, which is cool, which is fine, but I think that with this cast that it has, there were expectations that this game was going to be at least solid, and unfortunately, it's a pretty big disappointment. And normally on this channel, I really want to highlight and emphasize independent games that are unique and interesting and really good, and I couldn't do that when I was playing through Fort Solis. The first two chapters, in my opinion, really solid. I understand that the first 15 minutes are a struggle. It is a drag to get through at times, but I will say once you get into chapter 1 and 2 and you start beginning that investigation phase, it's a lot of fun in my opinion. I really like trying to learn about this abandoned facility, but when you start to get to chapters 3 and 4, you're just like, holy crap, the game does not fit anymore. It just, for whatever reason, just disconnected itself because you're moving at such a slow pace, and the game wants to move its plot at this breakneck type of speed, right? We have this guy chasing us with an axe or with a knife. He's unhinged, he's deranged, he's, you know, one of these crazy serial killer type characters, and you're still walking very slowly. It's like the equivalent of watching a horror film and you see that one character who's like tripping over themselves. That's essentially what that felt like the entire second half. The game just stumbles and becomes a flat experience after the first two chapters, which is super unfortunate. And it leads me to not being able to recommend this title to anyone unless you are a hardcore fan of the narrative genre and you want something new to play. But for $30, even that is too high of a price point for Fort Solis. I really think you should wait for a deep, deep sale for this game. That's going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I'm Ken from Pixelated Thoughts. I'll talk to you next time.